Hey everybody. Hope you don't mind. I slightly changed the title to make it just a bit more simple. So, I'll start with a little anecdote about me. So as I was graduating high school, I happened to be interviewed by a TV crew about what I want to do with my career and why did I choose the studies that I chose. It was just like a small soundbite, like for 5 seconds. And I can't remember the exact words that I used, but it was something along the lines of, I want to study international relations because I want to find out how the world actually works. I want it to be clear to me. I want to get to the bottom of all these like strange and chaotic events that happen on the news, but are really hard to explain. And yeah, I look on it back and I think like, imagine that, is there a better example of being like really youthfully naive to think that you could just like explain how human society works. And then to some extent this disillusionment carried over all throughout my studies, and then when I tried to start a career in like public service or whatever, because I kept having that analytical mentality when it comes to figuring out problems, and that's not really what is valued in that space. So then after a few years, my career led me towards IT and software development. And maybe precisely it was because I felt that that's where I could find like some value for these analytical skills. Like this is where things are precise and knowable, and that's where order is reigns. So when you find like, if there's like some report and there's some incomplete data, you could certainly get to a root cause of why that is. And I thought, yeah, that's really great. That's what I want to actually do with my life. This is a lot more fun. But the more that I hung out there, the more I realized that actually that's not where the most interesting problems lie. And if at first I thought I had some imposter syndrome, I quickly got over that because I actually realized that things are not so simple even over there. So I realized that most tech challenges are actually people challenges. This is something you may be you can argue against, but that's just my heuristic, and it has proven to be very useful. So in the next few minutes, I want to talk about how understanding the social aspects of what we do can make your lives as developers much easier and more effective. And when I say social part, I don't mean just getting beers, attending conferences, or it's not just about it. It is also about that, but other aspects as well. So, what makes software development social? Well, when you write some code, you are essentially giving instructions to a computer system. So once you get your code to compile and do what you want, you and your system have communicated properly. But of course, that's not usually where the challenges end. Especially as computing power has increased, many of these algorithmic challenges have become a bit obsolete. So that left even more room for what I would call other types of problem solving that are at some point related to how humans work. So I like to think of development as primarily being, therefore about communicating, not with machines, but with other people. And I think that was like the primary insight of the Agile movement. About how the hard part was not about like describing computer interfaces that we can do in an upfront spec, but actually, talking to users and understanding how this complex thing will actually play out. That is what makes things complex and unpredictable. So one other way that I try to think of like what you would call agile or just maybe good digital development is about these 3 levels of communication. So when you're doing development, in some extent you need to be communicating with your users. And that means like actually having conversations to discover needs and understand experiences and motivations. This is ultimately about like product discovery, product value. This is how your product is being used, and that's why it's valuable. You should understand that. Second, communication towards the stakeholders. that would be about like understanding the business. That is, most of us are involved in some kind of commercial framework within which the development happens. So that's like a really important dynamic underneath everything. But it's also about like, what's really important is also to understand what the perspective of the business user is as well, and what they need, how they can express this, how can they, get their job done using your tools. That's what's under that heading of communication. And then finally with teammates. We've evolved to a point where teams are really the fundamental unit of software development. And so, you can't escape the social dynamics that happen within a team. So that means conversations to solve problems, give and receive support, shape and implement decisions, so all of the good stuff that's happening with the team. But stretching the concept a bit further, in two ways, it's also about like having asynchronous conversations, so communicating with somebody that's not in the room, but maybe that's somebody could be future you. So figuring out how to create code that can actually demonstrate intent and communicate with somebody who is coming after you and reading that code, that's also a valuable skill. And I see there's also communication that's happening between teams, which has some particular attributes as well. It's not exactly the same thing as within teams. It shouldn't be, because that's why we have teams. But there does need to be that cross-team collaboration as well. That's a very important part as well. So how can we get better at this, at communication? I'm going to choose 3 disciplines that are more or less from the social studies domain, talk about them. First up, semantics. So semantics is the study of meaning, which is something that all of you have certainly some experience in, because everybody knows that naming things is hard. Why is that? Because the concepts we share are not universal. We don't share the same mental models ever. We can only reach approximations that are good enough. And then concepts change over time, so the underlying concept may change over time. Your name stays the same. That's a problem. Or it could go the other way, where actually labels change for same concepts over time. And again, then you need to adapt to that. So here's one, and that interplay between the words and their meaning is called a syntax-semantic interface. So the relationship between what is the word and what it means, and it's the subject of many like really abstract and academic discussions. But so we don't want to get into that. But it's just worth remembering that is something that's still to a large extent like mysterious. How that even happens on a human level. So don't underestimate how often this can be a problem in your communication. Here's one really common example, like when business complains that tech does not want to do the most valuable thing. Well, in fact, they do. They just understand what is valuable as something different than you do. You may have seen this video on the internet. It's a fun video where the dad gets his kids to draw up exact instructions on how to make a peanut butter sandwich. So the instruction was squeeze the jar of jelly onto the bread and put the other half over it, and this is what happened. And when the instruction was rub the jelly all over the piece of bread, it was really done all over. And so the mental models weren't aligned, and hilarity ensued. So what is the antidote? I think the best one is the principle of ubiquitous language, which is a concept taken from domain-driven design. And that means that you need to, whenever you're working or collaborating with anybody else, you need to spend some effort into defining what is the meaning behind the concepts that you are using. And this may strike you as borderline common sense, but it is, maybe that's why it is very frequently ignored. So we say same words, but we don't understand that there is differences in how we understand them. And then when it comes to implementation, there's also the question of depth, which means that if you agree on a ubiquitous language, use it all throughout the stack. So from the requirements to the analysis model and all the way down to the code. That would be the domain-driven design way to do it. Another field where at least a basic awareness of semantics might be useful is, of course, with AI, because large language models are heavily intertwined with these concepts, because it is about like creating huge networks of connected concepts that are expressed lexically, that means through words. So if I will want to go a bit deeper to understand how that works, which I haven't done, so please don't ask me too much about that. But it is where like there's so much overlap and so much value in understanding, the basic idea of semantics. All right. The second one that I want to talk about is psychology. So I guess after Tia and to some extent also Victor touched on some of these issues. We're still, this is a very psychology-themed day, so good for you, Nara, right? So we're all familiar with the basic idea of psychology. Psychology has a natural science aspect, where it has a lot of commonalities with neuroscience, but let's focus on the social part of it, where the discipline aims to understand the behavior of individuals and groups, which should actually sound very useful to you as software developers, because this is how it intersects with your work on several levels. Similar to what I was referring to earlier, thinking about your users, as we said, your success depends on how successful they will be in using, the solutions and that you provide to solve their problems. And that is guided by their motivations, desires, perception, and ultimately behavior. So this is more of a focus for design and product oriented team members, but don't make the mistake of completely delegating this kind of thinking, this kind of work to them, and because that may make you miss out on chance to becoming a better, even better developer. So on an individual level, this would be about like understanding user behavior, user research, the design part, so those aspects. But you could extend that to a more, on a collective level, how people behave collectively, which is more or less like the underpinning of how markets work, how the business works, and yeah, this will also be like an entry point into that aspect for you. Secondly, you have a psyche as well. And what I want to just touch up on here is the issue of personal motivation. So that's where a lot of like really fruitful and useful insights from psychology are as well. So how to remain engaged, how to remain happy with what you're doing. The framework that's really commonly evoked here is one by Daniel Pink. And it talks about the importance of these three aspects in your work. Have you seen any information about that? Read the book Drive? Simon has, I know that.
I recognize the three.
The three, yeah. Yeah. Well, autonomy means being self-directed and exercising agency within your locus of control. Mastery means that you want to become better over time about in what you do. And then purpose is about being part of something that you believe has meaning and importance beyond what you do. So these three are basically the pillars of how somebody feels about their work. So this came in 2008. What's interesting to me is that it's very much not a new idea, because there was a lot of really interesting research done after the Second World War and then in the 50s and 60s. It culminated in something called open systems theory. And it might have been a bit before its time, because we could really, I think, use some of those findings in tech nowadays, because it was very much built on the idea that you can have organizations that are set up in a different way, in a more democratic way, in a more participatory way, because those three aspects are also they're just like slightly split up here, but they're really important to be provided to every employee, and a lot of times it's missing today. So it was a big departure from older paradigms about organizational motivations, because it's not really about money or status or punishment, but it was more about how to create like harmony in the workplace. And then lastly, when it comes to your colleagues, like I said, teams have become a really important, like a fundamental building block of what we do, yet there is not really a consistent way of teaching these skills, either so the skills of how to do well together in a team, it's not present in our schools, and even for professionals who might need it within companies, there's not really that much focus on it, which I found a bit interesting. So we don't really. What I do find very, very useful as a framework there is one by Patrick Lencioni. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or heard me speak about that. So he wrote a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And we're not going to talk about the 5 dysfunctions. We're going to talk about the inverse, which is what makes teams work well. So I think this is a really good heuristic, so I want to share it with you. The first is that teams need to have the trust to speak their mind. So this would be akin to psychological safety. So what does trust mean here? Which is, by the way, another really commonly used word, which has, at least in my opinion, not so well understood meaning. So the way that I understand is mostly in 2 ways, but the one that is important is that you can know that if you say something, it will be received in good faith. So if I say something that's controversial, it won't cause a conflict, it won't cause somebody to be angry at me, but instead it will be understood that I'm trying to improve the situation. Because if you want to have a team, you're going to have differences of opinions. Like that's unavoidable. So if you don't express these differences of opinions, you're not a team. If you do express, if you feel the strength to say these things, then it might cause conflict. And then it's really important that the team is able to resolve that conflict. That's the second ability. Once you resolve that conflict constructively without causing pain or any hard feelings, you need to commit to those common goals and standards. Once you've committed to common goals and standards, you need to hold each other accountable when falling short, leading to some maybe, again, uncomfortable conversations, which need to be accurately resolved. And then ultimately, you need to align on the mission. You need to be playing the same game, we maybe aligned on the thing, but if in the long term, I'm just trying to get a promotion, don't really care about what's happening here in this team, that's going to be a problem. So those are the 5 things they build on each other. And I really think that it's really common dynamic not to even get to the first stage in a lot of teams. And if you don't have the first one, you don't have anything else. Okay, and the third one that I want to introduce is called systems thinking. So this is a fairly recent discipline, and it tries to provide the tool to explain the complexity in the world by understanding the relationships between different parts of the system, not just thinking about the individual parts. So when we think of systems, we oftentimes think of like computer systems or even physical, machines. But in fact, it is, in this context, it's usually used to make sense of like social phenomena, social networks, organizations, or even like on the level of a political community. It was actually first conceived by Donella Meadows, who was an American environmentalist. So it was about what we do to the environment and how to systematically think about how we can improve that, on a grand scale. But the main concept of system thinking is that the behavioral elements of the system is best explained by examining its place in the system and the connections and the feedback loops that are in place, not by examining individual events that affect it. So, practical example, if there is a mistake that happens in your team, don't spend too much time on the mistake. Think about like the connections, the events, the motivations, the feedback loops that have led us to this situation. Now, the author used these concepts to build up archetypes of systems that have a lot of practical applications. Let me show you a quick example. This one is called fixes that fail. So this is a causal loop diagram. So what happened here was that there was a problem symptom, and then we have an attempt to do a fix. So in this system, the fix fixes the problem system, but it also introduces a second thing, which happens by delay, which is an unintended consequence, which actually makes the underlying symptom worse. So let me give you an example, which you may be aware of. Company undergoing digital transformation, but without willing to learn. So a company realizes that they have a problem, they have a lack of digital capabilities. They try to hire consultants, and that fixes the problem in the short term, but it also makes the company more complacent about building up its own capabilities and learning on its own, which ultimately exacerbates the problem. Or I actually made one at some point as a joke about marriage infidelity. So you can really play with these archetypes because you can see them everywhere. But it's not really just about these archetypes. They're a fun tool, but ultimately it's about that complex systems have certain interactions that affect everything that's within that system. So one practical example of that is Conway's law. Have you heard of Conway's law? I got some nods. That's great. So Conway's law states that any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So this is, in practical terms, what a lot of times happens is if you have a weird architecture, it's most likely because the organization, the teams weren't set up thoughtfully to create a better architecture. So you can try changing the team structure to improve the architecture, although that's risky as well. But yeah, what the takeaway from that, this part would just be to think about when you're trying to improve the environment you're working in, to take a minute and understand the underlying relationships and motivations and forces that are invisibly shaping the way humans are behaving, and then look for leverage points. So that's another key concept in systems thinking. It's the small changes that you can make that a lot of times are very unexpected, but that actually have a profound effect in the systems, because the repercussions may be huge over time. So that's where it's easiest to make the change. The trick is to find them. They're often counterintuitive to find. Okay, so in conclusion, I haven't explicitly mentioned it yet, or I have once, but I find that domain-driven design is a very useful software paradigm, because a lot of these considerations that I was talking about are able to be resolved or mitigated if you use some of those principles of aligning the business and the tech through defining the domain and the subdomains and the boundaries within them. So the concept that it introduces that are really work well to mitigate the or improve the social aspects of software development are ubiquitous language, which I talked about, alignment with the domain, so getting cross-functional people, not just like tech point of view, but also from the business point of view, to be aligned, splitting the problem down to the level of a team, so having a team be responsible for a certain domain or subdomain, having the team participate in the business aspects of figuring out what it is that we could do. How could tech improve the business? So team-based product discovery, and then focusing on conceptual boundaries, because that actually helps all of these processes to move in a much better way. So in conclusion, my pitch to you is to ask you to embrace the humanity of software development and think of it as the yin to the, so if that's yin, yang is the logic, the tools, the frameworks, the order, and yeah, considered like pretty part of a whole. Because like if you went into programming wanting to deal only with the latter part, only with the logic, only the programming, then you probably had already a bit of a bumpy ride. Because as software has eaten the world has also changed software back. So it's become more cross-functional, more complex, more diverse, more humanistic, more like society. And I think this will only continue in the future. So thank you for your time. Yeah, that's me wrapping up. Please, for media-related inquiries, please call Victoria.
Thank you so much, Marko. We actually have time for maybe one quick question. So if anyone wants your 15 minutes of fame, this is your time. If not, you can find Marko any point today or tomorrow to talk more about this topic. Does anyone have a quick question? Yeah, here we go. So eager.
What was your favorite team you ever worked in, and what was the practice you used?
The practice wasn't at that point didn't really matter much. All that mattered was that we all had a positive attitude towards each other in the project. That was it. It was fairly short-lived for other reasons, but it was just the communication was fairly easy. So we didn't really get to any of the more like thorny problems that would show up later on, but I'm sure we could have handled it. Yeah.
Can I have a quick one? So you talked about common language.
Yeah.
But in our profession, we have synonyms for similar things, similar words for similar things. Does this mean that we need to stick to one and just use this one, or should we educate everybody what other synonyms mean?
I don't know. Could you give me an example of synonyms that you use?
I'm trying to.
I mean,
maybe a developer and engineer is something that is kind of similar.
Yeah.
Not everybody understands the difference.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, these things mostly, I think you just resolve it by just selling on a single expression and then not using it interchangeably. Like you want it just to be pragmatic to serve the purpose of that particular context that you're discussing in, and it wouldn't really matter which one you would choose. What matters is that if I would use those two terms interchangeably, it would probably increase the chance that somebody else would then think, well, is there a meaningful difference here, and that introduces more noise. But it's important to be aware of that when you are trying to have synonyms, that then makes it that you are not very careful about exchanging words. So if you settle, let's always use developer, and then if somebody, maybe like from the business, that's usually where you want to have these commitments. And then if from the business you start hearing, somebody keeps saying engineer, that's a good time to have a red flag to say, wait, why are you saying engineer here? Is this actually a different kind of person? Because most of the time, it's not a question of somebody needs to clarify it for somebody. It's the business doesn't have clarification about what it means exactly, because it may, in certain contexts it may be different. So it's just going on a journey together and sticking to what you know and building on what you've already clarified and checking for changes. Thanks.
All right, one last round of applause for Marko.
Thank you.